Hello, this is Russell Moore, and you're listening to The Russell Moore Show, brought to you by Christianity Today. Every week, we explore here conversations and questions from a Christian perspective to help you sort out how to live as a follower of Jesus in confusing times. And this week, we have a conversation to seek to do just that. This week is the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, D.C., and I am joined by United States Senator Chris Coons of the great state of Delaware, who is a co-sponsor of the National Prayer Breakfast. He has done this before with my friend, United States Senator James Lankford. It's a bipartisan event, Democrats and Republicans working on this. And he and I talked a little bit when we were together at the Gathering, an event earlier here in Nashville, about this year's National Prayer Breakfast, particularly in light of some of the heightened divisions going on in American life right now. Senator Coons, thanks so much for being on the Russell Moore Show.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Thank you, Russell, for a chance to be with you. I really enjoyed our conversation in Nashville, and I'm looking forward to continuing it today.
You know, I not referring to the National Prayer Breakfast, but I have a little bit of an allergy to prayer breakfasts and gatherings, sort of the Thanksgiving event that everyone participates in and so forth, because a lot of times they're sort of generic civil religion, really just about the community or the country and not really about prayer. How am I wrong on that? And particularly, how's the National Prayer Breakfast different than that?
Well, Russell, let me take a minute and talk with you, if I can, about how the National Prayer Breakfast builds on a foundation that I think is much more what you're talking about, which is an authentic circle of engagement and of witness. Every Wednesday in the Senate and every Thursday in the House, a small bipartisan group of senators and members of the House of Representatives gather, 24, often, 20, 24, 26 in the Senate, something I've participated in regularly in my 12 years there. And it is off the record. There's no staff, no press, no lobbyists, nobody but senators and our chaplain. And as a group, we gather to share our concerns about our families and our lives, to pray for each other, to hear a piece of scripture read and to sing a hymn. And then whoever is that week's guest speaker offers a witness about the role of faith in their life. And overwhelmingly, because most members of the Senate are Christian, that's a Christian witness. But we've also had, of course, Jewish members, one Buddhist member, others speak over the time that I've been there. And every time that I woke up in Delaware at 5 a.m., during the years I was commuting every single day in order to get on a train just after 6, in order to make it to the Capitol just after 8 for that breakfast. Every time I woke up and thought, really, do I want to do this? What am I going to learn from, say, a Mike Lee or a John Barrasso? I made myself go and was rewarded with some remarkable insights into the heart and the life of another member of the Senate whose politics might be very different from mine, but whose life experience was well worth hearing. That's really the spirit in which the National Prayer Breakfast began. And Russell, you're right that I've been to our state executive leadership prayer breakfast many, many years. I've been to the National Prayer Breakfast many years. Sometimes the size of it, the number of people, the production of it threatens to overwhelm the earnest, humble spiritual core that should be at the middle of it or at the center of it. And frankly, that's partly why a group of us in the House and Senate have worked in the last 2 years to move towards restoring some of the intimacy and the smaller scale. The National Prayer Breakfast Foundation is now separate from the International Foundation that had long funded and hosted the National Prayer Breakfast. They are still in some conversation because the speeches given in the Capitol Visitor Center will be live cast and watched by a gathering up at the Hilton and hopefully around the country and world. But after a 2-year hiatus when most of the National Prayer Breakfast was virtual because of the pandemic, We're reconvening this year in the Capitol Visitor Center, members of Congress and one guest only, mostly spouses, to hear from two different, really well-regarded preachers. I can't tell you who they are, but I think viewers will be pleasantly surprised at the capabilities, the authenticity, the preaching skills and background of our keynote speakers and our president. We'll have a musical guest, but it's trying to get back to that root. And I think your criticism is well-founded that sometimes public events can become more performative than spiritually authentic. And that's part of where the prayer breakfast began, where it is, I believe, every week in these small, humble gatherings, and where I'm hoping Thursday's National Prayer Breakfast will turn.
There's been a little bit of controversy, might be too strong of a word, but conversation about the International Foundation not sponsoring and supporting the National Prayer Breakfast this year. Of course, there have been some people who have put this shadowy idea of the family in really conspiratorial terms. What is there anything really to that, or is this just a natural handing over of the reins?
Look, I think what motivated the members, both House and Senate, Republican and Democrat, who embraced this opportunity for a reset, was a chance to have more clarity. As you know, your friend and mine, Senator Langford, chaired the Ethics Committee in the last Congress, and I was his ranking member. Now I'm chairing it, and he's my ranking member. To be blunt, when we were the co-chairs of the National Prayer Breakfast, it was difficult for us to be able to confirm that we knew who was invited, by whom they were invited, how the funds were raised. And we felt, and I'm not speaking for James, but I'll just describe conversations that we had. I think we both had some unease about the difficulty of demonstrating that we were fully engaged in and aware of exactly how the big event with thousands of people and a massive budget, what its origins were and who was donating and who was coming. And so when there were some critiques raised about how inclusive or exclusive that event was, and in particular, foreign visitors and what their motives were, I think James gave a very agile and appropriate response. He said, when I go to church on Sunday, there's a lot of people with mixed motives walking in the door. So when the critics of the larger National Prayer Breakfast started really criticizing who was there, both James and I said, we didn't review the guest list, and we're not personally accountable for who's in this audience. We were accountable for who the speakers are and the program. Unfortunately, Russell, over a number of years, the nation really only got to see the 2-minute clip or the 30-second clip of this president or that president, this critic or that critic of the president. And it was miscast as a political undertaking, when in fact, if you attended the whole event, the arc of it was really inspiring. I do think this reset allows us to focus on the core mission, which is a celebration of the power of prayer in the spirit of Jesus. It is not a Christian triumphalist gathering. It is open to all faiths and people of all backgrounds. And my hope is that this year's guest list will reflect that, that the speakers will reflect that. I've offered some input for the president on his remarks, and I'm hopeful that his spirit will reflect that. To the extent that we can show a spirit of humility, bipartisanship, or even nonpartisanship, and a respect for each other in the inclusive way that Jesus witnessed to the world and opened his arms to the world, then I think we'll have done something good.
You and James Langford would probably have exactly opposite voting records on most.
Almost literally. It has
literally.
caused us to chuckle some. Look, one of the best things that's happened to me in the Senate is a genuine friendship with James. I look forward to seeing him first thing on Mondays when we come back for votes. We ask each other about our families. We witness to we visit with each other about sort of, how are you? And then we go like this on our votes.
So someone was telling me, James and I have been friends for years and years, and someone visited his church and went to the nursery to put their toddler in the nursery for Sunday school, and said there were several teachers there. One of them was James Langford. And that this person didn't even know until later that this was a United States senator, and just there plugged in with his congregation, just like everybody else. That's not what a lot of people think of when they think of national leadership in the country right now.
Well, that's the kind of leadership that I respect, the humility that invests time in a way that isn't designed to get, Twitter followers or visibility on cable. But I've invited James to come to Delaware. He's been the speaker at our annual leadership prayer breakfast here, and gave powerful and I thought moving and authentic remarks. And he invited me to come to Tulsa and spend time with him at the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And I have. I hope to do more of that with him in the future. Look, our schedules are far too busy in the Senate. We don't spend enough time being, part of the kindergarten staff at our home churches. I can literally see my church from the window of my office right here, and was just reflecting on the fact that I probably won't make it this weekend. I have other commitments in Washington and New York. And too often I allow the schedule of demands of the office to override the commitments and community that I believe I'm also called to be a part of.
How is it in these gatherings of senators, the weekly, not the big public, but the weekly sort of prayer gatherings? I imagine it would be difficult to really have transparency and vulnerability when you know you're going to be in just a few minutes arguing against one another on really important issues. And it could almost be, I would think, sort of letting down your guard with your opponents and your rivals. Is that difficult, do you think, for some people, or have you been
Russell,
able to
that's
figure out how to do it?
you've got your finger on it. That is exactly what makes it so powerful. Is
Mm,
that um, you're standing up, and if you really embrace the opportunity, really unburdening your heart, really showing who you are to folks who maybe you don't spend a lot of time close and visiting with. And I still remember, look, one of the rules about prayer breakfast is we don't talk in detail about what
mhm.
anybody says. So I'll talk about myself. Um, the very, very first time that I spoke at prayer breakfast, I talked about my now late father, and what a risk he took when I was a child, to not just volunteer as part of a prayer ministry in my home church at our state prison, but to welcome to our home a convicted murderer who was part of a Bible study group in Delaware State Prison. And he had three young boys at the time. When your parents do something, you just think, okay, well, that's just my parents doing it. It wasn't until I was a parent many, many years later that I had any idea what an act of humble courage that was. My mom also, through our church, volunteered to welcome a Vietnamese refugee family. This was in the mid 70s when there
Mm.
were, thousands of refugees from South Vietnam. Mr. Vien had fought in the South Vietnamese army and was taken to a re-education camp by the North Vietnamese and separated from his family, and escaped and walked across Cambodia and Thailand and found his family. And so I spoke at prayer breakfast about the impact of these role models I had, and then about how I was trying to apply the gospel and how I tried to live my life, and with my wife, raise our kids, and things I've done in private life and public life. And at the end of it, so two things. At the end of that session, a senator came up to me, literally with tears in his eyes, and asked me to forgive him.
Hmm.
And I said, tell me why. And he said, well, I believed everything that I heard about you from your opponent and on radio. And I thought you were a horrible human being, a Marxist,
Mm.
a crazy man, a leftist, determined to destroy America. And I literally was praying for your defeat.
Hmm.
I contributed to your opponent. And now that I get a chance to actually hear you, I realized I was wrong. And I thought that was one of the most genuine moments of vulnerability I've ever. And I said, of course. And that began a really strong friendship. To your point about how hard it is to throw a punch at each other, at least in debate on the floor when you've held hands that morning in prayer. John Barrasso is one of the most talented and the most partisan at floor debate. And this literally happened to us. We were doing a joint TV interview on something when I'd spoken at prayer breakfast. And all I remember is that, we were going back and forth about this particular proposal. And I had the subjective sense of I said something and I thought, oh, nuts. I've stuck my chin out too far. He is going to clock me. I'd said something that really wasn't what I meant to say. And I gave him a perfect opening. And I sort of winced thinking, okay, here it comes. And he didn't. He changed the subject. And afterwards I said, John, you had a clear shot there, buddy. Come on. Like, what was that? I said, is that because of this morning? And he kind of looks away and goes, well, don't count on me doing that again. But yeah, kind of. Yeah. I've had experiences like this where, when my father died and I had to go to the floor of the Senate before I could go be with my family, the first two people who came up and gave me real hugs and words of comfort were conservative Republicans I'd met through the prayer breakfast. And I hope the same back. I hope that I was as good, not a colleague in the Senate, but as good a real friend to them. One's lost his wife. She passed 2 years ago, and the other his father. And look, serving in the Senate, being in public life, it's hard. Mm-hmm. You're always on. People are always critical. No matter what you say, I'm sure in response to this podcast, I'll get dozens of critiques. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that is special, Russell, about being a part of a weekly group that is vulnerable to each other is nobody else really understands the possibilities and the demands of this life, like other people who are trying to be faithful, trying to navigate the calling that we share, and yet, comes at it from a different perspective. And there is a certain grace or joy in being able to actually fellowship with people who maybe don't share your political agenda, but who maybe share your core concerns just as a husband and a father and a family member and someone trying to do right, even in such a difficult and divided moment for our nation.
I was talking one time to a group of my son's school to sort of a career day kind of thing. And one of the students asked the question, don't you think it's kind of fake the way these guys in the House and the Senate, they hate each other, but then they'll get up and say, my distinguished colleague, the right honorable gentleman from wherever. And I said, actually, I think maybe that was a problem before, but now it seems to me it's almost more dangerous for people who are on opposite sides of an issue to admit that they actually like each other. And so, I mean, if you have Nancy Pelosi standing up and saying, I'm praying for Ted Cruz right now, and I really like him as a person, even though we disagree. Or Ted Cruz getting up and saying, I really respect Nancy Pelosi as a person, even though we disagree. Both of them are going to get just barraged with people in their bases saying, how dare you say something good about. Does that seem to be getting worse in your view?
Look, it is on some level, you're absolutely right, that things are sharper and more personal, and many of us represent a base that expects us to throw punches rather than extend open hands. But bluntly, I can really only speak for myself because I'm responsible for my conduct. One of the reasons that when I was asked to co-chair the prayer breakfast by Tim Kaine, who was then running for vice president, to stand in his place, and, the unexpected outcome from my perspective was that President Trump was elected. And I went through with it with John Bozeman. One of the reasons I asked President Trump for the opportunity to pray for him and was comfortable and confident doing so on what was a nationally televised moment, was that I genuinely was praying for his heart to be opened and touched. From my perspective, the order he had just signed, barring refugees from certain countries, was an unfortunate decision. I wasn't praying. I did not use the words or the content of what I said to try and argue a point. I was simply saying, this is our president. Please, Lord, open his heart and support him in the service. And yeah, I got a ton of criticism for that. I got a lot of folks incoming saying, how can you possibly be seen praying with this man? And I said to many folks, did you not ever hear of the phrase, pray for your enemies? President Trump is a political opponent. But the goal here is to try and help break down the barriers of who we see as enemy. And one of the things I've encouraged President Biden in saying over and over, and this comes from him, it's not from my saying it to him, when he's talked about the battle for the soul of our nation, to also, as much as he can, demonstrate that for him, that also requires a certain humility and a certain willingness to say, this person, while they are a political opponent and have different policy priorities, they're not my enemy. In fact, I think he said that in his inaugural address, that we need to see each other as being Americans first and being fellow citizens first, and as opponents last, and be willing to have a spirit of compromise and of commonality. I do think we're in a dangerous moment for our country, Russell, exactly as you identified, in that even saying that, James Langford is a genuine friend and I enjoy his company, or that, I can give you a list of several. There's a number of Republicans I really enjoy and I like working with and traveling with. I just went to the border 2 weeks ago with a bipartisan group of 8 senators, Cornyn and Tillis and Chris Murphy and I, and many others, Sinema and Kelly and Moran and Langford. And every single meeting we were in, both places, Yuma and El Paso, the folks there started by saying, we've had lots of visitors. We've never seen a bipartisan delegation come here. And I was so struck by that they were all encouraged by the fact that, from John Cornyn to Chris Murphy, you had this whole range of senators trying to listen to what their problem was. Russell, I remain hopeful that your average American, not those who post the most on social media, not those who yell the loudest on cable, but I remain convinced that your average American actually wants us to solve problems more than we fight with each other.
You and I would agree on a lot of things, including probably migrant children, refugee children coming across the border, those sorts of questions. One area I think where we would disagree is it happens to be one of the most explosive issues in the country right now after the Dobbs decision, overturning Roe versus Wade earlier this summer, and that's the issue of abortion. As a religious, church-going person, are you bothered at all as someone who supports the right to abortion? Is that something you wrestle with? I suppose is what I'm asking.
There's a whole series of things, Russell, that I wrestle with. That as I went through divinity school and took classes in Christian ethics or gospel ethics, and as I read scripture and try my best to be a faithful person, I recognize, and I would hope others recognize, that the gospel is not a political tract. It does not deliver a clear agenda that says, of these things, you must make your first priority, and of these things, people of faith should have nothing to do with it or be concerned about it. There are scripture passages, as you know, that condemn, for example, swearing or blasphemy or adultery, for which we no longer stone people. And the scriptural passages, in my view, about poverty, about inequality, about how we treat the stranger among us, are abundant and clear. And so the way I look at this, I have to make choices. I think everyone who chooses to be an identified Republican and part of that agenda has to make choices. And I think every Democrat has to make choices and say, okay, out of the things that I find in Scripture that we're called to do, I really, really believe this is our number 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 priority. And these, I am hoping for forgiveness. I hope that when should I ever be blessed enough to have the chance to ask, Lord, what was it you most wanted me to do in this life? I'm hoping that I'm reading it right and that I'm making the choices right. But, I'm Presbyterian and our roots are in Calvinism.
Mm-hmm.
And, part of the doctrinal challenges of Calvinism are the belief in the fundamental depravity of humanity, our inability to actually reason our way to a correct answer. And so from that comes in my heart a sense of reliance on unearned grace and an undeserved calling. So I'm giving you an imprecise answer, which is there are a number of things that trouble me where co-religionists, people who share my sense of our place in the world and have what I'd call a kingdom perspective, we reach very different conclusions about what are the top issues in terms of the role of government in reaching into people's private lives. I had a wonderful visit in Missouri with a former senator who is the only other Yale Law School, Yale Divinity School graduate to serve in the Senate. And it was an interesting conversation. And he basically said to me, remember this, Chris, you and folks like you tend to believe that it's inappropriate for government to dictate about who we can marry, our reproductive choices, who we can love. But your perspective is that it's fine for the government to reach into my pocket and tax me in order to fund what you view as the highest callings about, clothing the poor and the naked and helping the widow and orphan and welcoming the foreigner amongst you. In both cases, this is essentially a question about what is the proper role of government in carrying out those things that we think are the highest and best callings of our faith. Russell, I don't know if I answered your question, but the short answer is, of course, I'm troubled about a very wide range of things where I make decisions every day about wealth and poverty, about privilege, about how I speak and with whom I speak. And I hope, if nothing else, what I convey to people and how I try to conduct myself is that I try to do so with humility and with clarity, that I struggle with a significant number of decisions that I make year in and year out, both as a husband and a father, as a member of a congregation and a community, and as an elected official.
I suppose one of the things that strikes me is that it's really a temptation for all of us to make invisible the stranger among us. And it's really hard in a tribal time when it's really difficult for some conservative Republicans to say, migrant kids, refugee kids, we need to pay attention to them. And it's really hard, it seems, in the Democratic Party now to say the unborn child is our neighbor, and we ought to be able to find nonviolent means to love both mom and child. I think maybe that's a challenge in front of us in the years to come. Do you think, if you think about the way that the 2016 and 2020 elections just seemed uniquely dividing. Churches, families, people don't speak to each other after those elections. And I think a lot of people thought if we get past the Trump era, things will cool down, and they don't seem to be cooling down. As we come into 2024, is that going to happen all over again, first of all? And second of all, I know you're close friends with President Biden. Do you think it's time to turn the page and not have two 80-year-olds running for president, but in both parties to hand things over to a new generation?
That's Russell. That's called a leading question. If I ever heard one, I think I know your view on this. I will tell you. It's funny you mention it. I literally earlier today was talking with a friend about one of my best friends from high school. Someone who I had all those experiences you have as a teenager. and who later was my housemate. We lived together for several years. I was in his wedding. Like we were that close. Over the 2020 election has just completely severed all ties with me. He was very angry and mistakenly believed that the election was stolen, that I somehow facilitated a stolen election. And that really bothers me. I miss him as a friend, and
Mm.
it weighs on me. And I know that's happened in lots of families. Folks who work for me over the last couple of years have hesitated to go home for Thanksgiving or Christmas because
Yeah.
they had extended family. They're often the only member of their family who works in politics. And so when everybody gathers around the table in, Kansas or Wisconsin or wherever they're from, the whole family sort of says, okay, you work in the Senate, so how can you support these heathen, Um, I would disagree with your assumption that the Trump era is over. I think our former president is still very much in the news, and
True.
with his restored social media presence, will continue to be an influence. There are a number of my colleagues in the Senate, both parties, who think that our country would be better off if we move forward from the two contestants of 2020 and the former and current president. Look, if President Biden chooses to run again, I will support him. I think he has a remarkable record to run on, in particular, including the way he's pulled all of us together to support Ukraine in fighting back against Russian aggression. And I know there's many in our country who don't see his record the way I do, but I'm proud to support him. I do think that when he ran in 2020, he talked a lot about wanting to be a bridge to a next generation of leadership. And I do think both parties would benefit from having a candidate other than former President Trump. So I'll say this. No one deserves more than President Biden the chance to enjoy his family and his grandchildren and to rest some after 50 years in elected service. But I also think he has shown in the last 2 years that the experience that he has built up over 50 years made him almost uniquely qualified to see the challenges of the world of China and Russia and to help us confront them and to deal with them. So I continue to support him and to be his friend. I do think that, as a country, whoever is our next president, it's my real hope that they will succeed in bringing us together. If you go back and, listen to what President Biden said at the prayer breakfast in his inaugural, it was very much focused on trying to bring Americans together. That's more challenging now than ever. I don't think he had expected the pandemic to be as politicized and divisive as it was. And I do think that after so much loss for so many American families, my hope is that we can move forward. There's still so much opportunity in this country, so many people inventing things and coming up with new ideas, and so many businesses growing and so many jobs and possibilities that I continue to be optimistic about the future of our country and hopeful that this next election will actually bring us together rather than drive us further apart.
You mentioned social media and the social media platforms. When you consider both sort of misinformation, disinformation, polarization, largely contributed to by social media presence, and then TikTok, questions of national security around TikTok. And of course, questions that most people aren't even thinking about right now in terms of artificial intelligence and chat GPT and those sorts of technologies. Are we at a point where the technology is so complex that it's impossible to regulate it and to get ahead of it the way that we did other forms of media in the past?
Congress is not covered in glory in its record on regulating rapidly developing and emerging media. I chaired the subcommittee on technology, privacy, and the law in the last Congress, and tried very hard to work with Senators Sass and Flake over the last two Congresses to make progress in this area. And bluntly, it's been very difficult. We don't have updated privacy regulations comparable to what the EU or the state of California have passed. I would have hoped we could have crafted something more bipartisan, more American, more effective. When you talk about the next chapter, which is artificial intelligence, quantum computing, semiconductors, President Biden and a number of our national security leaders are trying very hard to step up to the very real challenge presented by China and China's advances in these fields. We used to, decades ago, think about technology as being national security or purely commercial. Today, the number of technologies that are truly dual use that impact both our private lives and our national security have grown. You referenced TikTok as a Chinese origin social media platform. One of Senator Hawley's bills that actually was adopted unanimously at the end of the last Congress was preventing or forbidding TikTok to be downloaded onto government-owned phones and computers. I think that was the right thing. And bluntly, I think we need to know more about how the algorithms that drive social media platforms contribute to our distraction and division. Senator Portman and I had a bill in the last Congress to try and do that, to get under the hood of social media platforms and help the average American know what in our gut we think is right. Most of us as parents are concerned about the impact of Instagram on our children and their sense of self. Most of us who live in politics have seen the ways that social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, others, drive polarization. We're not doing a great job of regulating. Your question really, Russell, was, is it beyond our ability to regulate? And although I'm part of a denomination with Calvinism at its root, I do still believe in the potential of compromise and of rational discourse and of our capacity to regulate. Although, that's the whole underpinning of democracy, is it depends not on a few technocrats at the top, but on the will of the American people. The number of constituents, parents, colleagues, friends here in Delaware who've said to me, I'm really worried about what social media is doing to my kids, to our community. That says to me the American people are ready for us to act on this, and we need to step up and be deserving of their concerns.
You are the only other United States Senator I have talked to about total depravity and tulip, the other being Ben Sasse, who, of course, is now president of the University of Florida. Before you go, we have listeners across the political spectrum, left to right. And how could all of them be praying for you?
Look, I would just be grateful for anyone who's willing to include me in their prayer list. Just pray that I might continue to be safe and that my family is safe. This is a difficult time. If you've talked with Senator Sasse, many of us are concerned about our safety, that I might have humility and that my heart might be opened and be touched, and that my constituents might understand. Sometimes I think there's a real tension between being an elected official. Many of my colleagues don't talk about their faith because they don't want to have constituents feel distanced from them or disconnected from them, or worry that they have a moral agenda or a personal agenda that doesn't fit with serving them well. I made a choice early on when running to tell people that my faith informs my service, but that I try to serve in a way that is still respectful of people of many faiths and those who have no faith. I would welcome prayers across all of that. I know that was a very long list. And in the end, I think Scripture teaches us that it is simply the act of humility and of worship and prayer. And we should have confidence that God knows those things which we ask for his help with.
Senator Chris Coons, best wishes to you as you lead the National Prayer Breakfast this week. And thank you, sir, for being with us today.
Thank you, Russell. Thank you, Dr. Moore. Wonderful to be on with you.
Thanks for listening. Links are always in the show notes for resources mentioned in this episode, including a link about how you can have a trial membership to Christianity Today. Be sure to subscribe to the program, send an episode along to a friend who might benefit from it, and leave us a review when you can. It helps other people to find the show wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Russell Moore, and this is The Russell Moore Show from Christianity Today.
The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. Executive producers are Eric Petrick, Russell Moore, and Mike Cosper. Hosted by Russell Moore, produced by Ashley Hales, associate producers Abby Perry and Azrae Phelps, CT administration provided by Christine Kolb, social media by Kate Lucky, director of operations for CT Media is Matt Stevens, production assistance provided by Core Media, audio engineer is Kevin Duthu, coordinator is Beth Grabencourt, video producer is John Rowland. The theme song for The Russell Moore Show is Dusty Delta Day by Lennon Hutton.